Before we begin, I will give an opportunity to the BPS representatives that are here tonight to be able to introduce themselves. So you put in a name to the face of the individuals who support our children. I will start with Lauren Viviani. Lauren, would you like to come on and introduce yourself, please?
Hi, sure. Thanks, Roxy, so much. Thank you all for having me. My name is Lauren Viviani, and I'm the Interim Assistant Superintendent for Special Ed and BPS. And we have a special guest, Dr. Chen is on. I don't know if you guys knew that, so I'm not sure, Linda.
Linda. Let me see, we may have to ask her to unmute. Give me 1 second. Dr. Chen, are you available to unmute and introduce yourself to the community?
Oh, it just got activated. Thank you, Roxy. Good evening, everyone. It is so good to be here with you. My name is Linda Chen, and I serve as the Senior Deputy Superintendent of Academics for the Boston Public Schools.
Great, thank you. And I know we also have Michelle Tran on the call currently. Michelle, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi. Thank you for having me. My name is Michelle Tran. I'm Assistant Director of Special Education for Boston Public Schools. I support Region 7, which is mostly high schools.
Thank you. And we also have Dashi Perez. If you'd like to introduce yourself, who's always here supporting us every month. It's always good to put a face to that name also.
Thank you, Roxy. Good evening, everyone. I am Yashira Perez. Buenas noches a todo el mundo. Mi nombre es Yashira Perez. I am the Family Engagement Coordinator for the Special Education Office, and I'm going to put my email in the chat if you need to contact me. Thank you, Roxy.
Thank you. And Pinky, I will have, if you don't mind putting your question or concern in the chat, just because we'll address things we can in the chat before we get to the point of the questions. So thank you. So with no further ado, because we have plenty to talk about tonight, I would like to introduce Stephen Chen, who will give you a little bit more detail of his history, even though he's at a school right now where he did work in the equity office with a high focus on 504s. So he's able to give us some more information, because frequently we've heard from our families, why is this student on a 504, but this student that has ADHD is on an IEP? Why does it go that way, and what is the differences? So we thought we'd start with a brief overview of the 504 versus IEPs before we go to Dr. Simon, who will focus on ADHD and how we can make sure our students are supported well who are working with ADHD. So Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. As Roxy said, my name is Stephen Chen. In my current role, I am an assistant head of school at Boston Latin School, where I oversee the, excuse me, apologies for that, where I oversee the special education and student support team. And in my prior role, where I worked in the BPS Central Office, I was actually the ADA and 504 coordinator for the Office of Equity. And so that's sort of why I'm in this meeting, and that's part of the reason why I've been asked to speak to you today. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And as Roxy said, I don't have actually a ton of time today. And one of the key things that I just wanted to highlight is this is a really, really complicated topic. There is a lot of nuance that goes into Section 504. In the 10 minutes that I have, what this really is designed to do is primarily to give a 1,000-foot overview of exactly those questions that were discussed, which is, what is a 504? Why is there a 504 versus an IEP? And more importantly, if you have additional questions, it's really important to know that the school administration and the coordinator of special education assigned to each school will be able to answer very, very specific questions. So one of the things that I will not be doing is talking about individual students or individual situations. And as I said earlier, if you do have a student on a 504 IEP, or that is something that you want to explore, please reach out to the school's administration and or coordinator of special education or COS, and they'll be able to answer some more questions. But one of the key things that I get a lot is, well, what is the 504 process? So we're going to talk a little about that. Examine really common 504 accommodations. I want to be really clear in this meeting that this is not an exhaustive or even a comprehensive list of 504 accommodations. It's really, really important to note that all of this is really done through the team-based process that's done at each individual school. I'll also talk a little bit about some of the procedural safeguards built into 504. And then at the end, if there's time, I'll be happy to answer as many questions as I can. So to get us started, what is Section 504? And what that really is, it's short for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And it is a federal civil rights law that specifically protects the rights of individuals with disabilities. And so one of the key things to understand about Section 504 is Section 504 is designed to provide students with disabilities the equivalent services provided to students without disabilities. In other words, the main question that we're asking when we think about Section 504 is, if there is a student with a disability, how do I get them equal access to the curriculum, to the programs, to what's available at the school that a student without disabilities has access to? And so if we were to boil this down into its three most basic forms, students may be eligible for Section 504 if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Each one of these elements could be its own lecture in a law school class about what exactly an impairment is, what exactly substantially limits are, or what exactly are one or more major life activities. One of the most important things to understand about that third element is there is no comprehensive list of what major life activities are. The Department of Education has issued out some guidance around some basic things that may be major life activities, such as eating or attending class and attendance or vision. But it's really, really important to note that all of these Section 504 plans really are individualized plans for students specific to their disability. So there is no qualifying list. It really is dependent on the individual student. The important thing to note, though, is that all three of these requirements must be present to be eligible for a 504. So this gets to, well, why do some kids have 504s and why do some students have IEPs? So this isn't the operative thing to understand about IEPs versus 504s is one is not better than the other. They're actually two completely different laws. As I said earlier, 504 comes from the Rehabilitation Act. IEPs come from a law called the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so with these two different laws, two different goals are the intentions behind each of these laws. So specifically under an IEP, the IDEA stipulates that special education is specially designed instruction at no cost to the parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. And so when you have a student with an IEP, that's going to be an in-depth document that has for students that describes all their special education services. So one of the key things to understand is IEPs typically will provide services and supports such as specialized instruction that 504 plans don't. So in other words, if you have a student who's on an IEP, oftentimes what you'll see is you'll see specialized special education teachers. Sometimes they're going to be co-teachers. Sometimes they're going to be resource room teachers. Sometimes you're going to see specific learning accommodations where we're pulling students out of classroom in order to do executive functioning or math or reading goals. So in other words, the way that we think about IEP is those are going to be specialized services that are specific for students with disabilities. Under a 504 plan, the key difference is we're not looking at specialized instruction. What we're really looking at is providing educational services and accommodations so that students have equal access to the students without disabilities. And so generally speaking, a 504 plan can accommodate students who can learn within a general education environment with some accommodations. In the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what some common accommodations are, but the important thing to note is typically students on 504 plans are not working with special education teachers in that specialized learning environment. So another really important thing to note is you may have students with disabilities and they meet all three of those elements that I talked about before. Those three elements of a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The key question under a 504 analysis is, does the student have equal access to the curriculum and to the academic programs and the academic opportunities in the school? So there may be some students with disabilities who are doing who are getting full access to the school, and that is based off attendance, that may be based off of academics, that may be based on a number of different factors. And so a student may be eligible, but you may also find that they don't need a 504 plan. So what are some of these common 504 accommodations? So basically accommodations first, they're changes to instructional or testing procedures and materials that allows a student to access the information and accurately demonstrate knowledge. So in other words, when we are talking about a 504 and we're talking about accommodations in a 504, these three things are kind of operative in terms of thinking about this. They don't change the content of the instruction. So I'm not reducing in terms of like, well, we have to change the curriculum or we have to change the approach to teaching. We don't change the expectations for learning. So in other words, the assessments are going to be the same. The projects are going to be the same for a student on a 504 as they are for a student who's not on a 504.
Stephen?
Yep.
I'm just going to pause you to ask you if you could just slow down just a little bit.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
They also do not reduce the requirements of the task, right? So a lot of the time what you'll see is if there's going to be a 5-page paper that's due in a high school English class, a student on a 504 would also be writing a 5-page paper, but they may have certain accommodations related to their disability in order to get access, full access to the curriculum. So what are some really common accommodations that you'll see? And I want to be really clear, this is not a full inclusive list. So for instance, you might see something like Braille, right? So a student who has a vision impairment has access to the same reading materials that other students have. You might see text-to-speech software. You might see advanced organizers. One really common thing that we see all the time in 504s at the school where I work in is extended time on tests. So as an example of this, oftentimes we have students who get a time and a half. And so for a test that normally takes 30 minutes, a student, in order to get equal access because of their disability, would get 45 minutes to complete the same test. Sometimes you might see accommodations for taking a test in a separate room, or allowing typed responses as an alternative to handwritten responses. I want to be really, really clear right now. This is not inclusive. This is not comprehensive. These are just examples, but it kind of gives you an understanding of what equal access is under a 504 versus what you might see in an IEP that has specialized instruction, right? And specialized in specific modifications to the academic environment. In the event that a 504 the 504 process starts, a 504 process is going to look very, very similar in process to a IEP. A team of teachers, a team of individuals, including teachers, including medical professionals, the student's parents, in many cases, the student, the school-based team. They will be meeting as a 504 team to review all relevant data in order to come up with number one, eligibility for a 504. And if a student is determined eligible based off of those three criteria that I shared out earlier, the next step is then to determine, are there any accommodations in the 504 plan that would help the student achieve equal access to the curriculum? In most cases, the team process works, and if there needs to be modifications, parents are always welcome, and the team is also always welcome to ask for a reconvening of the team in order to continue adjusting a plan as needed. However, in some cases, if there is a disagreement with the 504 determination or 504 plan, it's also really important to note that parents do have the ability to appeal a decision to the 504 compliance coordinator. And that's a district level position. They also, if that's not working, they can go straight to the BSEA, which is the Bureau of Special Education Appeals. If that's not working, parents also have the right to go to an impartial hearing officer, and parents also could go to the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. You do not need to go in this order. Parents can certainly reach out to any one of these departments or any one of these agencies if there is a disagreement. But I will say that in the role that I have, where I do oversee a lot of this work, oftentimes the first place to start with is often the coordinator at the school or an associated administrator. And I would say the vast majority of some of the disagreements or some of the places where they're not disagreeing, the parent team, the students, and the school-based team might not necessarily be agreeing with the outcomes. Like that's kind of the first place where I feel like most of these conversations start. So to, again, as I said earlier, contact the school principal or designee, and also recognize that the Office of Equity does have a Section 504 compliance coordinator, and then also the Office of Special Education can also be helpful. As I said earlier, this was a super fast primer on just some really basic things about Section 504. I'm going to pause there and just see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm gonna have to work on you taking in every 3 sentences like a. So Sarah Anderson does have a question. So I'm asking Sarah to unmute.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for this session. I'm coming at this from the perspective of ADHD having subtypes. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the ways in which the district is helping to identify accommodations and IEPs based on subtype. Because my experience is that ADHD in the district is providing resources based on the hyperactive impulsive subtype and less versed on inattentive hyperactive type.
I don't know if that's a question for me or for Lauren in special education.
Lauren, do you want to take that question?
Sure. Could you repeat it one more time? I just want to make sure there were like a couple components.
No problem. I'm just thinking about this as ADHD is more of a spectrum, and we have subtypes. And can you speak to the ways in which the district is helping to identify accommodations in IEPs based on subtype? Because my experience is that ADHD in the district, with the district, is that it's providing resources based on more of the hyperactive impulsive subtype and less versed on inattentive and distractible type.
Yeah, thank you so much. For an IEP, I think that it's really dependent on the needs and the assessments that what the student shows and how we provide those accommodations based on the present levels of performance and then the goals of the student. I think that the next presenter will have a lot of suggestions that we can take from and share with families and with our district staff and our teachers, because it sounds like this is an area where we can grow. And so I'm happy to continue this conversation after this presenter comes.
Thank you. So we'll take one other question from Courtney. I'll ask you to unmute. And then Stephen, if also, as we go on, you can answer some of the questions in the chat. while Dr. Simon's speaking, that would be helpful. So Courtney?
Hi, thanks, Roxy. I just wanted to it's sort of a little bit of a comment and half a question, but I think, and I don't know if the next presenter will get to this, but I think it's important to remember that the 504 plan comes from the Rehabilitation Act as a form of anti-discrimination. And so it's important to say that the legal basis of a 504 plan is to ensure there's not discrimination against a person with disabilities in an education setting. And whereas the IDEA provides defined disabilities that qualify you for an IEP, which also entitles you legally to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So I just, as you're thinking about it, it's just important to frame out that you have to get into one box by having one of the recognized disabilities in terms of what you're thinking about it. And the other one is designed as an anti-discrimination message. So I think, again, this is very confusing, and especially with things like ADHD and things that we're here for, it gets all very gray very quickly. But if that helps sort of clarify that, you had started to talk about the laws, but I thought that could be further dug into a little bit.
Yep, I'll just respond to that really quickly. 100%. Thank you for that clarification. And if I'm ever asked to present again, I think that's certainly a clarification that you provided that we can absolutely clarify. But yes, yes. The other question that I had was, does a 504 have to be reapproved every year? And
So, Stephen, I'm just going to pause, because what I'll have you do is, if you don't mind responding in the chat everyone, that would be helpful. And I'm also taking a question that was direct message to me, putting it in the chat so you could address it so everyone can see the answer, because our next speaker does have to get started speaking. But I really appreciate you taking the time to support the questions in the chat and also answering our families. And if you're willing to also put your contact information, if they had a question about something you said tonight, and people could still reach out to you and say, hey, what you said, could I ask you something about that? That would be helpful too. So thank you. So we are going to move on to Dr. Simon, Dr. Kevin Simon, if you'd like to come on and introduce yourself.
Yep. So hello to everybody. So I'm Dr. Simon. I wear a couple of hats. So I'm the Chief Behavioral Health Officer for the city. By clinical training, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, an adult psychiatrist, and an addiction medicine physician, operating out of, so on the city side, the Boston Public Health Commission, but clinically, I'm at Boston Children's Hospital. And so I'm going to talk about ADHD, and in part, Roxy, if it's okay, can I just answer a question that was raised earlier?
Absolutely.
So in reference to, as one of the, well, Stephen was mentioning, and then someone who was highlighting the laws. So ADHD, which yes, does come in 3 subtypes. So ADHD hyperactive presentation, ADHD inattentive presentation, ADHD combined presentation. ADHD technically is not one of the defined 13 disabilities that is a list like for the IEP. However, a person could have ADHD, and because of the ADHD, there's manifestations that end up looking like a learning disorder, but ADHD by itself is actually not one of the listed conditions. So whenever you see someone with ADHD that does have an IEP, it's more than likely that there's another condition that does fit the criteria, and then or the ADHD might be prohibitive of allowing the person to demonstrate that, for instance, can maintain in their seat. And so it it it's just not one of the core 13. So there's 13 of them, 13 conditions that classically qualify for individualized educational plan. So in terms of when is it going to be on the list, that is not a decision that the city makes or the district makes. That's at a federal level. But I do appreciate thinking that I can make it be on the list. So what I'd like to do is I'll share my screen, and I'm going to present some information on ADHD, particularly how we come to diagnose it. So what's the criteria that the pediatrician might be looking at, or the child psychiatrist might be looking at. Then we're going to talk about interventions, so behavioral interventions, and then pharmacologic interventions. And hopefully questions will come through the chat, and Roxy will pay attention to those questions and then shout them out at me, and I will try to answer as best as possible. I prefer this to be fairly interactive. I recognize that there's a number of breakout rooms for the interpretation, but if people have questions along the way, I much prefer to answer them. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. And I believe you can see the screen now. And so what is ADHD? It is a neurodevelopmental disorder that can affect a person's ability to regulate their behavior, their attention, and their emotions. And again, there's this cluster of conditions or cluster of symptoms that you recognize, hyperactivity being one of them. So that's the classic kiddo that really seems like he or she or they have a motor going on inside of them. The impulsiveness, similarly with the activated motor. But then there's the inattention, and inattention is important because it can be the one that is either misdiagnosed, or the person isn't even captured because they're not necessarily causing as much commotion as the hyperactive presentation would. So this is some national data. About 6 to 7% of school-age children, and actually even 4% of adults, have ADHD worldwide. So it is relatively common. And then in terms of boys and men or versus girls and women, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. Boys are more likely to demonstrate the disruptive symptoms than girls, and then girls are more likely to demonstrate the inattentive symptoms. And so when we say inattentive symptom, when I see someone, they have to meet 6 of 9 of these various symptoms. So often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes, often has difficulty sustaining attention, often struggles to follow through on instructions, often does not appear to listen, often struggles with organization, often avoids or dislikes tasks requiring sustained mental effort. So this is the one that particularly stands out with ADHD, because one could say, wait a minute, 1 through 5, my wife might tell me that I have these. Because the reality is she has to tell me things multiple times. Now, when we say the often part implies it's happening in multiple domains, right? So it happens at home. So mom has to tell, little Bobby, little Jane, hey, did you pick up your shoes? Did you pick up your shoes? Did you pick up your shoes? And then in school, the teacher has to say, hey, little Steven, Remember, you got to put your pencil back, you got to put your pencil back, you got to put your pencil back. Oh, and then also, even on the basketball court or on the soccer field. So if it's only showing up in one domain, it's very likely that it's not ADHD. The reality is ADHD doesn't turn off. So just to finish the symptoms, often loses things necessary for tasks, often easily distracted, and then often forgetful in daily activities. And this is another key one, the easily distracted. So clinically, when I'm with a youth, this being distractible is a hallmark of ADHD, and that very small things get their attention. So one of the classic ways they used to kind of assess, you might give a child, so let's think about a 10-year-old or even 8-year-old. You give an 8-year-old 10 questions, math questions that they should actually be able to answer, right? So you're not giving them a question that they can answer, they should be able to answer, but just the fact that it's 10 and you give them a long piece of paper and you see, can they make it all the way to 10? Oftentimes the inattention and the distractibility, because they'll see something that they, are excited about, they don't make it past 6. Because why? That requires some sustained attention. So that's the inattentive. You have to have 6 of the 9 of these. In terms of the hyperactive, this is the classic, looks like they have a motor. So fidgety, restless, has difficulty remaining seated, runs and climbs excessively, right? So kids are supposed to run and climb, but when it's excessive, it stands out. Has difficulty engaging in activities quietly, again, driven by a motor, always on the go, talks excessively, blurts out answers before questions have even been completed, difficulty waiting their turn, and then often interrupts or intrudes upon others. And so again, you got to think about, this isn't just at school, it has to show up at home, it has to show up in extracurricular activities. If it's there, it would show up at church. So ADHD does not turn off. So whether it's inattention or hyperactivity, it's a good chance you would see it in multiple domains. And Roxy, just as I'm talking, hopefully I'm talking at a decent pace. And then are there any questions that you think?
You do have questions. I
Yeah.
want to be mindful that 'cause I think some of your questions might be answered if you have a slide that may discuss, what we as parents can do at home to support our students, and then recommendations for what schools can do to support them.
Yes,
But we can
yes,
definitely jump in a couple of questions in there to mix it up.
Yep.
I will say, first one was, can you describe the data instruments used in annual review meetings to collect feedback from teachers? How are the instruments tied to delivery of specific goals and services for IEPs and delivery of specific compliance with accommodations from 504s? How are tools similar and how are they different?
So that specific question, right? The tools that's a tool that might be utilized in the school. And so classically, when a school creates a accommodation plan or an IEP, they may demonstrate that, we're going to meet with the youth twice a week. And so it would be on the school to pick or choose a tool that they're going to say, pre and post, pre-intervention, pre-IEP, child did not have this. Post-IEP, child had this intervention, there's been benefit. I can describe to you a tool that we use clinically to screen for ADHD, and that's called the Vanderbilt. And so this might be the form you get from your pediatrician or your specialist. And in the Vanderbilt form, it would be 2 forms for parents and it's a pre-medication, post-medication. So you want to just describe what you see, and then you also give it to the teacher or a teacher you trust to give you an accurate description of what's happening in the school system. So in terms of screening tools, there's the Vanderbilt and the Connors, and Connors is utilized for those that are after older than 13. But the Vanderbilt can also be used for persons who are older than 13, but if you want to be very specific, Vanderbilt 12 and under, Connors 13 and up. You'll often see the Vanderbilt utilized even in clinic spaces because the Vanderbilt is free and accessible. Connors, you have to, clinics would have to pay for.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question is also looking at, they asked if you could, do you find if there's an overdiagnosis of ADHD based on race? And another similar related question, or not, is ADHD genetic?
Yeah, so, and that I will answer. So in reference to the racial demographic, so it is actually both sometimes over and under diagnosed. And the reason for this is the underdiagnosing may be that there are other factors that can cause youth to have poor inattention, to be hyperactive. And so one of those things that I can easily think about is having a trauma experience. And so if you have a trauma experience, and trauma could be emotional, physical, sexual in nature, a youth is more likely to have a startle response. That's something that we would call, and less likely to be comfortable seated, be comfortable being calm. And so trauma could look like ADHD. So there are several things that ADHD could quote unquote mimic, and then there are certain conditions that could mimic ADHD. And so this is why you would want somebody who's comfortable and has expertise in treating and diagnosing, because I've seen individuals who there was no diagnosis until later, 9, 10 years old, when you likely could diagnose ADHD even as early as 6 years old. So again, depending on the school environment and the feedback that the school is giving to the parent, but then also how's the parent perceiving their youth, right? Because I can tell you that in certain cultures, they just say, oh, well, you know, Kevin just has energy. And so we'll just put Kevin in swimming, we'll put Kevin in basketball, you will find that some parents will, to counteract the hyperactivity, they just place their child in a lot of different activities. There is a both misdiagnosis, but this is for all conditions. I don't want to make it seem as though only ADHD. The fact is, when you have BIPOC children, children of color, it's very important for a clinician to be nuanced and culturally humble to understand what the parent is describing in terms of what they're recognizing, and then also recognizing what the youth experience is within the school environment or within the extracurricular activity environment. And so we generally, as a child psychiatrist, the first time that I meet a family is not the first time that I'm diagnosing the condition. I do want to get a broader sense of what all is going on. It doesn't take long for a child psychiatrist or a really trained pediatrician to recognize ADHD, but you just want to ensure that you're not misconstruing other things for ADHD. So I'm gonna reshare my screen so that way some of the questions that were coming up will be answered.
And one of the things that does come up is Are you willing to share your slides? Because people would like to be able to.
So these are copyrighted, so I can't share them. It is created with me, but also with colleagues at Boston Children's Hospital.
Thank you.
So
if you think of a resource or a summary of something of the key points that you might be able to develop that our families could review, because it's helpful to be able to hear some information tonight, but also be able to look at it later. If you have something like that, we could post it on our website so our families could access it, because that's going to be really helpful.
I will inquire of colleagues who we do have ADHD information for parents, and so what I'll do is I will get you that copy, and then you can post it to the website, so it's available for those that are here, and then those that aren't able to make it. So we talked about the three types: hyperactive, inattentive, or combined. And the combined just means that you met criteria for hyperactive and inattentive. In terms of, and the fact that you're here, when I'm just commending you, meaning all of you, you're going to recognize these things. So how do the symptoms of ADHD affect your child's life? Peer relationships, right? So if your child struggles with their impulsivity, right? Physically intrusive, touchy, butts into activities, insists on having things their own way, right? Misses social cues because they're distracted, they're not paying attention. Their peer relationships may not be as strong. Adult relationships, oftentimes when I engage a parent, by the time that they've reached me, they might have tried several different types of therapy, and the parent feels a level of exhaustion because again, the kid might have a motor and or school's not going as well as they anticipated. So you start to recognize these child-parent dynamics that undoubtedly the parent wants to feel better about not reprimanding the child in a negative way. Academics, they're going to have greater difficulty in academics, and then leisure activities, sports and games, again, following rules, paying attention. These are going to be more difficult for the youth that has ADHD than the youth that doesn't have ADHD. Earlier, the question was about genetics. So where does ADHD come from? So it is multifactorial, but in terms of genetics, we know that there is a genetic component, right? So there is a genetic component because siblings of a child with ADHD has a 15 to 25% chance of also having ADHD. So they have done twin studies and recognized, oh, wait a minute, if one has ADHD, there's a very good chance the other does. Identical twins, 80% chance that they have ADHD. Now, it's unclear how the genes necessarily interact, but we have identified different loci or locations of genes, clusters of genes, and in certain families and certain people, the clusters of genes indicate, yes, ADHD is present. One thing to note, ADHD, because sometimes parents will ask, well, won't my child grow out of this? So the hyperactivity will settle down as the youth is just getting older and their entire brain is developing, right? So the executive functioning, or if you put your hand over your forehead, that's the executive functioning part. As that, yes, develops, you're better able to control yourself. And you might also recognize the thing that you need to do to better manage your inattention. But it actually is going to be with your child, who then turns to the adolescent, who then turns to the adult. Because it is actually a lifelong condition. I have treated adults who learned that they had ADHD as an adult as a result of their child getting treated, and then they're realizing, wait a minute, that really worked for that child. And then the parent subsequently gets an evaluation and realizes, oh, I've been having this the entire time. genes interact with the environment to cause ADHD. So again, here the genes can interact with the environment to cause ADHD, which is to say that your surroundings over time can be passed down from generation to generation. And so environmental conditions that increase the risk of ADHD, environmental conditions that increase the risk for ADHD are low birth weight. So those things that can cause low birth weight, smoking can cause low birth weight, alcohol use during gestation can cause low birth weight. That can cause ADHD. Fetal alcohol syndrome, again, alcohol, that can cause ADHD. Nicotine use during pregnancy, that can cause ADHD. Exposure to lead, yes, that can cause ADHD. So it is just acknowledging that the environment can influence the genes, turn on, and then ADHD is present. Now, earlier there was a question about ADHD and IEPs, and how come some youth seem to have ADHD and have an IEP, and some youth seem to have ADHD but not have an IEP. Again, under the law, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, itself is not a learning disorder, and so it is not one of the 13 conditions for being eligible from a criteria standpoint for the IEP. However, ADHD is very commonly co-presented with other conditions. So oppositional defiant disorder, 50% of persons that have ADHD, 50% of those that have ODD have ADHD. Now, a learning disorder, 25% of people with a learning disorder will have ADHD. So you could have a learning disorder, that's one of the 13, that's your criteria. And then you also happen to have a child that has ADHD. So it might, from an outsider perspective, might look like, oh, ADHD must be the reason why this person has the IEP. Actually, no, it might actually be that they have a learning disability, and that's the reason that they have the IEP. It just happens to be that in addition to the learning disability, they also have ADHD. And so this is a really subtle nuance, because again, you could say, wait, my son, my daughter has ADHD, how come I don't have this? It's actually ADHD is not one of the 13. Conduct disorder, 20% have ADHD. Anxiety disorder, 25% of persons with anxiety disorder have ADHD. Mood disorders, tic disorder, and then autism spectrum disorder. Now, autism spectrum disorder is one of the 13 that qualifies as a criteria for IEP, right? And so if you happen to see ASD and then ADHD, don't misconstrue that the ADHD is the reasoning for the IEP. It's actually the autism spectrum disorder, because that's one of the conditions that is on the list for the IEP. I'm going to stop sharing again. I'm hoping Roxy's paying attention to the
We
chat.
got plenty of questions for you, absolutely.
Sure.
So one of the questions asked, and I think perhaps BPS can also support with this question. The person's asking if you could speak to the diagnostic and evaluative process for determining
Yes.
ADHD. And the reason is very specific, because they're saying BPS is still recommending a neuropsych while the field is moving towards a clinical interview. Neuropsych is extremely expensive and often unavailable. So just want to know, like, what is the thought in the field currently?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I'm not a BPS employee. So from a child psychiatry vantage point, so I'll tell you 3 vantage points. American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and then American Academy of Developmental Pediatricians. In terms of how we diagnose, and what I'm going to do as I'm doing this is pull up the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. how we diagnose ADHD is vis-a-vis a clinical interview and utilization of screening tools. Now, you might say, well, why would we need, or why is it suggested to get a neuropsychological evaluation? A neuropsychological evaluation looks at, yes, and they are very expensive, looks at multiple domains. And so you have memory, you have reading, you have language processing. So when you have multiple domains, and Roxy, whoever asked that question, thank you for asking, because I'm going to bring in something. When you have multiple domains, this is where it can be demonstrated that you have a learning disorder. So it's very, very, very hard for a child psychiatrist or any pediatrician to look at a child and say, oh, that child has a mathematics learning disability. It's just very hard to do that. I might suspect it, but I'm very unlikely to write that down as a disorder because I'm not doing an overt test of the mathematical skills, or I'm not doing an overt test of the language processing, right? So when you get the neuropsych, which I'm going to show you how complicated a neuropsychological test can be, that may be why, again, I'm surmising here because I'm not a BPS employee. That may be why BPS would advocate for a neuroeducational evaluation, because you do want to understand, well, if this youth is not learning something or is not demonstrating the ability to learn, okay, well, why? Is it verbal reasoning, word processing, memory, visual, spatial issue? That you can pick up on a neuropsych report. I might feel that something's present, but it's much more difficult to understand which domain is the issue in just a clinical evaluation. So I mean, my colleagues do the neuropsychs, and I'm often engaging with them. They might ask me about, again, mood disorder, ADHD, but the neuropsych, it is a pretty fundamental way at assessing learning disability. So if you're questioning, is my child learning the way that they should? Again, I might have the feeling or the suggestion that they made. The neuropsych is going to be the route that tells you the domain that the child's having the challenge in. Hopefully that was clear.
Thank you.
Oh,
One thing I will say that's been in the chat a few times too, cycling through, is also about the fact that ADHD, for some of us who do have IEP, some of us, it is under health impairment. And Laura has been kind enough to share in IDEA the health impairment section 300.8 for a reference point for ADHD and be under the health as one of the 13 for an IEP. Right. So I've seen that cycling in the deck. So I just want to bring that to light just because it's been going back and forth.
And so even acknowledging that, it's also, so again, each parent should leverage things to their best usage. The fact that it's within a other also is acknowledging that it wasn't one of the first 13. So things may have shifted. And so when there's a defined 13, I'm just acknowledging you just,
right. No, I understand. I just want to say, because it's going to be determined at everyone's individual meeting what their specific child needs, whether it ends up being
Right.
IEP or 504. And I don't want to get boggled down in it because you have a lot of great questions here. And we also want to hear from your presentation what you have.
Yeah.
I will ask if it's not in the presentation you think you'll get to, but right now a couple of questions have also been about, are there trainings or recommendations for that you know that can help teachers understand how to really support a student that has ADHD? And then are there accommodations that you recommend or in general or are recommended for a student who may have ADHD and it's not the hyperactivity, it may be inattention or another aspect of it?
Are there general recommendations for the youth that has the inattentive type?
Yes. And then
So,
also recommendations for resources so teachers can learn how to support students.
yeah, so with regards to the teacher aspect, so what I'll say is there's no one gold standard of teachers should utilize this learning module versus that learning module. There are a multitude of learning modules that do exist that can help a person, so I'm not specifying teachers here, a person to feel better in understanding ADHD. And so I know that there are, for instance, within the school-based collaborative, the school-based collaborative, there are a number of organizations, and there's more than 26. I'm just naming some. I don't mean to not name others, but there are some organizations within the collaborative that do offer trainings for teachers. And so what might be a really good suggestion is to ask the school-based collaborative group if that is something that they can do with regards to some subset of teachers that might be particularly interested in understanding ADHD. But there isn't just one modality or one module that I can say, oh, if you watch this, you're going to know about ADHD really, really well and know how to treat it. There just really are a lot of nuances to it, which is why there are clinical professionals. But in terms of the basic understanding, I do think that the school-based collaborative could be a venue that can support educating teachers. Yeah, and so what I'm gonna do here, and this is not to be exhaustive, it is just to demonstrate how complex the neuropsych evaluation could be, okay? So you're looking at a laundry list, and I'll walk us through it. So when a neuropsychologist or a school psychologist does a neuropsych evaluation, right? So there's an intelligence test, and there are several. And so the person has to choose the appropriate intelligence test. But they're going to choose an intelligence test, you're going to see it, and that's where you get the whole IQ of 100, IQ of 110, IQ of 80. That's the intelligence test. You're also going to see achievement test, right? An achievement test is an assessment that measures a student's acquired knowledge and skills in one or more educational areas: reading, mathematics, language. And we happen to have individual tests: the Wechsler, the Peabody, the Woodcock, the wide range. And this just describes so for instance, the Woodcock, what it does. That I don't want to go over. I want to so test of inattention, test of memory, test of language, test of language development. So you can see how the neuropsych, and they don't do every test. They You would choose one or two for intelligence. You would choose one or two for achievement. Right? So you're not doing every test that you see here. And it's that composite put together makes the picture, or i.e. the 20-something pages that neuropsych reports end up turning into. It's because they collected all these tests together. And this is why it also takes a very long time to fully write the report. So again, intelligence test, achievement test, test of attention, test of memory, test of language development, test of motor development, right? So visual motor integration. There are a number of tests that a child can be exposed to that make up the actual neuropsychological report. And that's, again, why it ends up turning into this 20+ page report, because it's very detailed. That is not something that a child psychiatrist, neurologist, pediatrician is going to do in an office. The neuropsychological report or the test itself is over several days, over several hours. So that's another reason why there's a extensive cost to it. However, unfortunately, and this is where advocacy is very important, it would be helpful for many if neuropsychological reports were covered under insurance plans. Yes, yes, it is free if you do get the school psychologist to be able to provide it to you. What I want to do is pivot to someone asked a question about specifically how is ADHD, like how do we come up with the diagnosis and what does that, I suspect the next question will be, what does that treatment look like? So I want to answer that.
Right, because the next questions, and being mindful, we have 20 minutes left.
Yep.
It's a lot focused on, when we have children that have executive function deficits and severities of different levels, what can we as parents do? How can we support our students at home? And what can we potentially, because we know it's there are options that it's going to be tailored for our individual children. What are good supports that we might be asking for our children, and that things that we might also be able to do at home to really support them?
Right. So being mindful of the time, the 20 minutes is still a good amount of time. I'm going to go through how we get to the diagnosis. If you were to see me, what I likely would ask you. Okay. So ADHD, preschool and school age diagnosis. Okay. So assuming that you have a 3 or 4-year-old, visit scheduled, and there's concern about behavior or school performance, or let's say we have an older than 5, classically there's gonna be behavior issue, school performance concern. Okay. I'm gonna screen for, is there any history of trauma exposure? Right? Because again, what that trauma can look like ADHD. Is there poor sleep? So OSA is obstructive sleep apnea. Substance use, for those, I need to screen for that for persons who are 12 and up. Or is it anxiety or depression? Okay. Those are things that I want to overtly ask about. Now, you'll see here within the clinics, the person would have filled out a screening tool. We go down. Is there a history of or screen concerning for trauma, depression, anxiety, substance use? Let's say that it's yes. Well, we want to slow down on saying this might be really, really ADHD. We'll say, okay, wait a minute. Let's pivot and pull in our social work colleagues and think about what else needs to be going on here. Because if one of these is true, it might make the child look like they have ADHD, but we need to address substance use or depression very differently than ADHD. But now let's say there is no concern for depression, anxiety, trauma, substance use. What would I do? I'd give you a parental Vanderbilt form. We talked about this earlier. All right, the parents Vanderbilt is positive for ADHD. Okay, it's positive. Say, okay, now I gotta think. Vanderbilt is positive for also ODD. Maybe is it positive for conduct disorder? Is it positive for depression? Is it positive for anxiety? So the Vanderbilt, there's 40 plus questions. They're clustered in the arrangement where I'd recognize, oh, this person also, maybe I should ask more questions about anxiety, ask more questions about depression. So if that's a no, so it's, the ADHD is positive, but the other conditions are not positive, keep going. All right, provide parent information on managing attention concerns, because a lot of parents may not say they want to provide their child with pharmacologic intervention or medication. So we would describe, for instance, here, I might say, oh, are you aware of social learning theory, right? Because oftentimes there'll be this question about something happened, he blew up, he broke his video game. And so I gotta say, oh, let's figure out how to get ahead of the triggers that cause the behavior. So we say antecedent trigger, what's the situation, what's the setting, behavior, what did you recognize, what did you see, and then what was the consequence, right? Oftentimes it can be, and I'm a parent, I fully accept this on myself. There are times where we want to say the consequence is not our fault. Well, if your child ramped up and you were trying to get them to ramp down, but then you also got ramped up, well, what do you think is going to be? The undesired behavior is going to go down or going to go up? Well, if you ramped up too, there's a good chance later in the day or another day, you're both going to get back ramped up. So you have to be able to recognize antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And this is where engaging the clinical social worker, the case manager, the pediatrician, you actually can, or even parent groups, you can have groups together and figure out, okay, how are we managing this? And the reason I'm saying groups here, this copyrighted material that I'm demonstrating to you, we would use this in groups of parents, because the reality, there are not enough child psychiatrists, psychologists. So we would use this in a group, and we'd have like 4 or 5 families and walk through this, and they'd have homework to do, right? But because this education that hopefully you're experiencing, you feel like, oh wait, I'm gonna understand this more. I'm gonna understand my child more. So you can think about parent group. So I'm gonna go back to what I would do. So I would talk to you about that. I'm gonna request that the Vanderbilt is completed from the school, and I'm gonna schedule a follow-up. Hopefully it's within 60 days. I'm gonna review that Vanderbilt. Does the person meet criteria? We're not gonna say no, because we're talking about ADHD. I'm gonna screen for other psychiatric conditions. And let's just say that no, they do not have any other psychiatric condition, anxiety, bipolar, conduct, oppositional defiant disorder. I'm gonna ask the audience for a school-age child that is older than 5. What is the first line treatment for ADHD? Whether it's inattentive, hyperactive, or combined. Older than 5, first line treatment for ADHD. What does the audience believe? And Roxy, you're gonna be my help here.
Absolutely. Maybe I wasn't paying attention sometime. If the 2 hands up are interested in answering the question, bribery.
Sure.
Okay, so let's see. Evie, your hand is up. Are you interested in asking? I'll ask you to unmute. Sorry about that.
Yes, please. It's okay. My name is Liza, actually. I don't know why I can't change my name.
Okay.
Sorry. I know I don't have much time. I am beyond frustrated. So, I tried my daughter on meds. She's 11 and a half. They just didn't work. She was super, super, super zombie-like on the first one. Second time was during homeschooling, and she was super, 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 super emotional. Oh gosh, there's so much. I'm trying to get this question out as quick as I can. I need help with other than meds, please.
Mhm.
Also, I'm sorry, I've been typing a lot in the chat because I would love for parents, maybe a class for us to how to help our child at home, or I'm old school. I Google things, but I like to do things the old school way. So parents, how do we understand better? What can we do to help our child more? Also, very, very important, I would love for other students who do not have ADD or ADHD or do not know what it is, I would love for them to understand it better, because my daughter has been bullied due to the fact that she has ADHD and she can't sit still, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I have so much more to say, but
Time is limited.
yeah, point me to the right direction, please, somebody. Thank you so much.
Well, so
Whew.
thank you, Liza. So whether we're talking about any of the professional societies, so there are, and if there's questions, keep chatting away. In reference to the treatment, so there are behavioral interventions. So, for instance, parent-child intervention training, PCIT. There's parent behavioral training. There is, so for instance, someone described the executive coach. That's not cheap itself. So there is that. In reference to medication, now here's where I actually am really, really well suited to have this conversation. So there are a number of medications. And Roxy, how much time do we have here?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Oh, this is perfect. Are you, well, I know Liza's excited. So there are a lot of medications. And what I'm gonna try to do in our 10 minutes, and maybe Roxy, we just need a part
10 minutes and other questions too.
Yes, we just need a part 2, Roxy. Everyone say part 2 in the chat, so Roxy feels very compelled to invite me again. So in reference to medication, because technically that is the first line, and you say, well, Dr. Simon, those SHIT things don't work. And I would say, actually, the evidence is that if there's 10 children, you give 8 to all 10 the ADHD medication, 8 are going to find benefit. Now, why don't you find benefit, or why do parents end up like Leslie, like, my child was zombie-like, my child had an emotional reaction? Oftentimes, unfortunately, I'm going to say the physicians maybe are not as nuanced as we could be in terms of dose and choosing the appropriate medication. So in terms of our youth, right? So we're talking about youth here. I'm going to share my screen. So for youth, in the event we're in a space where we're comfortable with the idea of medication, and if anyone ends up meeting a family that I've engaged, they will tell you, oh, actually, that sound doesn't necessarily push medication. Again, you have to be comfortable with the idea of providing the medication, and I got to make sure that I explain to you what to anticipate when you take the medication or provide the medication. So in reference to medications, we broadly have 3, so actually, I'm gonna not share yet. We broadly have 3 categories. So there's stimulants and then there's non-stimulants. Within the stimulants, there's 2 branches: methylphenidate derivatives, and the grandfather of methylphenidates is Ritalin. Then there's amphetamine derivative, the grandfather of amphetamines is Adderall. Now, I'm going to now show you that we have a very long laundry list of agents to potentially provide to you, but there's a way to provide it. You don't just say, oh, well, 20 just because I think 20 is the appropriate number. No, that's not appropriate. So you're now looking at methylphenidate formulation. I'm going to confuse everybody because I'm going to go to page 2. Oh, these are all the amphetamines. Okay, that's page 2. All right, we're going to go to page 1. Why? Evidence would suggest in youth, the first line within the stimulants should be methylphenidates. Then you say, well, why, Dr. Simon? Because between the two, methylphenidates are softer. They're not as strong. And you say, well, how do I know that? So let's look at this column. So you see here, it says 18, then this one says 10, this one says 8.6, this one says 10, this one says 10. Now, someone might say, oh, 18 is the strongest one. Interesting enough, 18 is the weakest one. So sometimes stimulants that are paradoxical in terms of their dose number. So when I look at Concerta 18, I know that's very soft. And so Concerta 18 is equal to, for instance, Metadate 10, right? It's just very important for a pediatrician, for a child psychiatrist to know this. I can tell you there are many that confuse this often. And so now the question is, methylphenidates generally should be the first line within the choices because they're soft. Now, sometimes your insurer is going to guide us in which one could we give. And so, for instance, Mass Health is comfortable with methylphenidate extended release, i.e. Concerta, because again, it's soft. They know that. Now I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. Question is, well, how do I know what dose to give to my child? Hopefully your child psychiatrist tells you, your pediatrician tells you. So in terms of the dose range, okay, there's a calculation here, so sorry for the non-math folks. So 0.5. Oh, when I say soft, I'm to say that yes, it's gentle. It is not as harsh, and harsh is even an inappropriate word. Amphetamines are stronger. It gives someone that on-off effect. They definitely know it's in their system. It's like taking a dirty chai, i.e. a chai tea with an espresso. You know you've taken an amphetamine at the right dose. So in terms of dosing, we have a range, and this works for kids because kids classically are small depending on what age. But we do 0.5 milligrams per kilogram up to potentially 1.5 milligrams per kilogram. So if someone told me, I'll use my child. So if my child, for instance, is 40 pounds, okay? So I'm just taking out my calculator. If a child is 40, let's say 50 pounds. If a child is 50 pounds, I got to convert that to kilogram. So you can see 50, you divide it by 2.23, it's 22 kilograms. And what did I say? 0.5 milligrams per kilogram up to potentially 1.5. So when I see that this child is only 22 kilograms, and I want to be conservative, I want to make sure that they don't experience headache, they don't necessarily experience the decrease in appetite, I'm going to start on the lower end of 0.5. So 0.5 times 22, well, that'd be about 11, right? A half. And so if I know that to be the case, I might then say, oh, you know what? Your child's really small, and I'm gonna share my screen. Your child's really small, and honestly, she or he should be at 11. Well, we got 10 here, but again, if you happen to be working with me, this would happen. You got 10 here, but they're small. Let's actually try a 5. And this is immediate, this is a short acting. Oh, look at the yellow area. And you'll see Ritalin 5. Now, your kid may not necessarily look like they immediately gain some benefit. But why am I giving you a 5 when I calculated that it should be around 11? I want to make sure that you do not engage with me. I give your kid a medication and you got to go to the hospital or they're throwing up. I want to make sure I'm undershooting so that way you feel comfortable with the idea of even providing the medication. We can always work our way up. It's much easier to work our way up. It is much harder to work your way down. If something bad is happening, you want it out fast. If you're taking it and you don't recognize necessarily that there's an immediate benefit, but we're really low, well, I can just keep incrementally going up. So this is one of the things that, unfortunately, within the broader like healthcare field, we don't really do a good job. So there's a dosing that you can do to ensure that your child's on the lowest dose possible, and you incrementally go up till you see the benefit. Another thing that
Dr. Simon, thank you. Because I just want to be mindful that, you know, unfortunately, when slides aren't shared, we're not going to remember the dosing. The key point, I think the takeaway from that is really that trial and error and remain safe at that dose.
Start low.
With 1 minute left,
Sure.
I want to give Lori an opportunity to ask a question because her hand's been up for a very long time.
Oh, sure.
Lori, I've asked you to unmute.
Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I have 2 different children. One is older, almost 18, and one is younger than 11. And with the medication that we have tried, one makes one want to eat, like I don't feed him, and one makes the other like you don't feed, she doesn't want to eat at all.
Right. So several things. It was suggested we're not going to talk about like individual cases. However, just generally from what I'm hearing, one, I also don't know what the medications are. If you want to say them really quickly.
Yeah, one is atomoxetine. A lot of people don't know what atomoxetine is.
Just say the name. Just say the names. One's atomoxetine. What's the other one?
And Adderall XR.
Okay, so atomoxetine is Strattera. It's one of the third-line non-stimulant medications. And then Adderall XR is a mixed amphetamine salt. It's an amphetamine. So again, not knowing which kid's taking which, Strattera or atomoxetine actually can cause GI issues for kids. And so again, this is where we kind of start really slow. And it's one of the ones that like, it's the classic side effect is the GI distress. For the Adderall XR, again, depending on the dose, I don't know the doses here, depending on the dose, that could cause someone to have a decrease in their appetite. Now, Roxy, I know that we have like some school officials here. There's a lot of parents here. And we're probably like nearing time, supposedly. On my own accord now, school officials, anybody wants to leave, by all means, you can. It just happens to be, if anyone wants to, well, I can't say this because it's not my meeting, but Roxy, I'm letting you know that.
So you're available to stay and answer questions longer than 8:30.
Yes, but it's not my meeting. I fully.
No, and that's appreciated. We have to be mindful of our interpreters that are generally scheduled to 8:30.
Yes.
But if people do have questions and they want to linger on to be able to have a conversation, I'm fine with that. Because, you know, if this is question, once again, we cannot do child specific because it's general, just so people remember, this is going to be general with the idea of taking these ideas to then the individuals actually know your child well and having you be able to have that perspective, or maybe that part 2 meeting, you know, but I definitely think those are components there. So it is 8:32, so I know that some people may have to leave because of the time constraints, but Dr. Simon has said that he can stay and answer some additional questions if people would like to also get that opportunity. I will say 2 things from the chat that I wanted to just make sure I got to do, because those were in there a while, was a question about studies, the medication and the studies used that their understanding is that studies were done with boys and not as much with girls, and if that has changed recently and there's more research looking at how girls are reacting to medication. And then the other one that is a little bit different related is the Vanderbilt, their neurologist told them the Vanderbilt is not effective for kids who have inattention type. Whereas earlier you mentioned the Vanderbilt's generally used for ADHD, but in this case, they just wonder about that perspective. And one other thing I'll say, I just want to thank all the families that have been sharing resources in the chat too. We're trying to just pull them so we can compile them. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So if you want to address the Vanderbilt not being used, whether or not it should it be used for students who maybe have more of an inattention, and then the study if the medication has really been looked at with girls.
Right. So in reference to the Vanderbilt, this is the Vanderbilt, and you're seeing it. We're going through it. Vanderbilt parent informant, and as you answer these questions, and it's a little inaccurate to say it doesn't capture inattention well, because there's specific questions that are here specifically for inattention. And so I'll just say it's just not an accurate statement, but that provider might have that experience for them. So we are all entitled to our variety of experiences. But this is the Vanderbilt, and you'll see how the clusters 1 to 9, 10 to 18, 19 to 26, 27 to 40, 41 to 47, 48 to 45, 55. Those are the clusters in attention, inattention, anxiety. And then you'll see the teacher form. So we want both parents, guardians, and teachers. So that's the Vanderbilt, and it is freely accessible for any person that wants to download it. In reference to the do studies include females? Yes, and even some of the older ones. In reference to, at one point in time, in the field of child psychiatry, we were really trying to identify markers for aggression. And so at one point in time, there were studies targeting boys, but actually there's actually older studies that look at ADHD, and again, include females too. So again, I'm very mindful of not stealing people's time. So if people need to
Thank you. If people need, I would first ask that if the interpreters, if you could ask in your channels, if you have any families that may want to ask a question utilizing interpretation services, know that interpreters, if you are able to stay, you will obviously be compensated for your time staying additional. But if anyone in your channel does want to ask a question, I would do those first, just because some interpreters may have to leave right away.
Mhm.
And while they're doing that, if others also want to raise their hand, we can let people unmute. Please just try to keep your question concise, and remember, he's not going to be able to give advice like on your child's unique specific situation versus more of that general guidance that to get to that step to get the supports. So Vilma's taking right advantage of it. So I'm going to ask you to unmute, Vilma.
Thanks for taking my call. I just want to double check. My child has been on a medication for a couple of years, and I would like to know what do I need to check on his physical exam so I know to address that before something happens with his GI, things like that.
So I mean, I don't know your child, don't know the medication. However, you also did alert me to certain things. My child's been on the medication for several years. Oftentimes when, and this is for any medication, not just stimulants, oftentimes when an adverse reaction is going to occur or a side effect is going to occur, it often is in the beginning when that medication is introduced to the youth. The other time that you might recognize an adverse reaction or a side effect is when something's been stable, right? So 10 milligrams or 20 milligrams stable year one, stable year two. But then year three, for whatever reason, there's a recognition that maybe symptoms are coming back and now you want to up the dose. When you increase the dose, there might be opportunity for you to be more judicious in making sure, asking questions like, hey, headache, GI distress, appetite. But if a child's been on a medication consistently and not complaining about anything and the dose has not changed, you should feel relatively comfortable that that dose is not going to miraculously make your child feel unwell. So that's how I would interpret that. Now, if the dose change, then that's a different conversation.
Thank you for your time.
No problem.
Thank you. And JK, you're up next.
Hi. My son was actually asking a question. He wanted to know, like when he got tested in the neuropsych and the whole thing, he wasn't on medication.
Mhm.
And now that he's on medication, he wonders if he should be retested now a couple years later.
Great question. I don't know who your kid is, but great question. So why is it that neuropsychological reports, if they're done, are done like every 3 years? Because it is very unlikely that the domains would significantly change in a year's time, even with medication. So you might improve, but the substantive change would not be so drastic in a 6-month timeline or in a 1-year timeline. Honestly, even 3 years, because I read a lot of reports, the shift isn't that great. Now, if something happens, concussion, there's been an actual injury, yes, there might be change. But if your child was relatively, not getting in dangerous accidents at 9 and they had a report done, and then you get the report at 12, what might shift the emotional component, so you might, the anxiety's been improved. But in terms of that, the domains that I mentioned, the intelligence, the word processing, is a good chance that they'll be relatively the same. But every 3 years it's done when people do have the IEP. That just seems to be a very common practice, both when I was in Georgia, in other states, and then now here in Massachusetts. I want to, and if other questions come up, Roxy, do let me know. I want to share information about a study, because someone was asking about studies. So you'll see here, this is Lancet Psychiatry 2018, comparative efficacy and tolerability of medications for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children, adolescents, and adults. We won't necessarily care about adults for today. And what did they do? They looked at over 133 double-blinded randomized controlled trials. 81 of that 133 were specific to children and adolescents. So one is just a lot of trials. How many kids did they look at in these 81? The analysis of efficacy, closest to 12 weeks, that's just classically how long trials last, was based on over just about 10,000 children and adolescents. The analysis of tolerability was based on over 11,000 children and adolescents. And you gotta say, well, what did they find, Dr. Simon? So sorry for all these numbers here. For ADHD, core symptoms rated by clinicians in children and adolescents all included drugs and were superior than placebo. So providing a first-line medication at the right dose is better than placebo. And I'm going to scroll down. So interpretation, taking into account both efficacy and safety, evidence from this large meta-analysis supports methylphenidates in children and adolescents and then amphetamines in adults as preferred first line. Now, if your child's already on amphetamine and doing well, don't go to the doctor. But I heard this guy, Dr. Simon, and he said amphetamines they should be second line. Why is my child on? No. This is one study that looked at a large number of studies, but if your child's on, and so again, I even prescribe amphetamines. So don't walk away from this like, oh my gosh, my child should not be on amphetamine. I'm just demonstrating that there's a lot of information, and so it's why you want somebody that has this kind of understanding that can share with you information, so that way you as a parent can be well informed about the decision that you're making. So that I think that's the responsibility that physicians we have, is providing you with as best information as possible for you to make the decision for your particular child. But Roxy, question?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to address Marlena's, Rihanna's iPhone. In answer to your question from that chat, so this particular meeting is specifically on ADHD. If you want to reach out to us at Boston SpEdPAC at 411@gmail.com, we can definitely get you connected to those in BPS who may be able to help you or see what we can do to help. The Spanish interpreter put in the chat that you have a parent that has a question. So I just wanted to ask the Spanish interpreter if you were ready to bring forth that question. Tracy? Yes. Can you say it out loud? Because I missed some of it in the chat because it wasn't clear to me what was being asked. So can you say what the parent said? Because what I see in the chat is there was some time in Q, my daughter retains what Q studies spend 1 day and you forget things, you will need medication. My daughter had a trauma that I asked the specialist. So I'm not clear on what that question is though.
Mom is saying that her daughter's having a hard time retaining information past 1 day, and she forgets things a lot. She might need medication, and that the doctors have shared that she might have experienced a trauma that might explain why she has this going on at the moment. I only caught 2, Roxy. I don't know if there are more.
So I guess I would just echo what her providers have said. Again, hearing this small bit of information is difficult to make appropriate formulation, and forgetting something or inability to retain information past the day. I would need more context, but I definitely would bring that up to the pediatrician, and if there's a concern and a desire for like a child psychiatrist, you could ask your pediatrician if they're a part of something called MCPAP, MCPAP. MCPAP, Massachusetts Child Psychiatry Access Program. And so a person can get a one-time evaluation from a child psychiatrist who will then provide recommendations for the primary care provider. That's MCPAP, MCPAP. I saw Miss Le Rouge. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. Your hands up.
Mr. Rouge, I am asking you to unmute. You would just have to click the message that you're receiving to unmute. While she may be stepped away for a moment, there is a, oh wow, it jumped down. A question about a 14-year-old weighing 170 pounds that was taking 20 milligrams Binase, and the doctor changed the dose to 40 milligram. Now he has dizziness after taking it.
Vyvanse.
Oh,
Yeah. So again, I don't know the person, but in terms of answering questions that any person might have about Vyvanse. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so you're all seeing very colorful screen. Look at the blue. And you see Vyvanse, Liz, dexamphetamine. So if somebody, I'd have to look at the chat. Was on 20 and then jumped to 40. Yeah, okay. So was on 20 and jumped literally to 40. And if the child, again, you got to listen to the child, right? So I'm just going to blow this up so that way that parent sees, right? So Vyvanse, and went from 20, jump to 40. There's a 30. So if for any youth, if they're taking a medication and they are recognizing that, hey, this medication make me feel dizzy past the day, you got to listen to youth. They know their body, and just inquire. So I heard that there's a 30. Is it possible that my son or daughter can take 30 and just drop down a little bit? So again, I told you, it's much easier to go up slowly than it feels disconcerting to say I gave too much of something, whereas I gave too little. Say, oh, I can go up a little bit more.
Thank you. And we are going to start to wrap up, but I wanted to question you put in the chat, Laura. How do you deal with severe rejection sensitivity? So there were other comments in the chat about rejection sensitivity and the connection with ADHD. Rejection
sensitivity. And so I take this is more of a psychological development. So this is me putting on like my psychotherapy hat. So in terms of youth and this idea of rejection, right? So if we were to think about stages of development, emotional development, we have some that we know to be very, very reproducible, true, and so I'm going to share them with you. Oh, it's so small. Okay. I will share. All right. So you're looking at very colorful graph. It says stages of psychological development. And we're just going to jump to the 5 to 13, 13 to 21. And then you see these words: industry versus inferiority, identity versus role confusion. it is in this age range. Again, the person did not tell me the age range. It is in this age range that it is appropriate for you to be trying to figure out who you are. And so you want to be industrious. You want to be able to demonstrate that you mastery of something, right? This is why kids like sports. They like video games. I can master something. They really want to show mommy, hey, look at this, right? Now, in reference to the rejection sensitivity, rather than identifying the youth and saying, well, you know, why doesn't the youth figure out how to have strong ego functioning? I might reframe that and say, how much affirmation can I be giving to my child, right? Because the world is the world. Inside your home, you kind of control it. And you can be affirming that you are beautiful. You can be affirming that you are smart. You can be affirming all these things, validating those things. When a kid, all of us, every person that's here, likes to be validated. When you're not validated, it feels very uncomfortable. So my daughter, the person that writes her E's backwards right now, right? I keep it up there because when she comes in, she sees that. And she knows, oh, daddy I wrote that for daddy, right? I'm validating her, I'm affirming her. So if a youth seems to be struggling with quote unquote rejection sensitivity, it is particularly that youth that's the youth that I would, as a actual like recommendation, I wish I could prescribe it, but as a recommendation, I would say, oh, you should be strategically having short, I'd say 5 to 10 minute, intentional listening sessions where the parent listens, right? You become the receptacle. It is very, very common to want to course correct for your child. Oh, why did you do that? Why did you respond that way? Why don't you do that? But if you actually create an environment where your kid knows, I can tell mommy something, I can tell daddy something, and they don't immediately reject it. They don't immediately tell me that I was wrong. They don't immediately tell me how to do it better, but they actually let me figure it out, right? You are affirming that you know, you, the child, are smart, know how to do this. And so something that happens often, and we see this, a youth shares information with somebody else or does something that you're like, I didn't raise that child. No, you didn't raise that child that went and did the other thing, but you also perhaps did not create the environment to let the child say, wait a minute, I want to tell my mom first, then tell somebody else. Or I want to have this conversation here, then over there. So you having to create a affirming environment is very, very, very important. And so, oh, I meant rejection from peers. So this again, now this might be, I'd have to actually do a whole like social history here. Meaning like I ask questions about the peers where the person is getting rejected. In reference to, I mentioned the industry versus inferiority. So this is where you, again, I don't know how old the youth is also, but this is where you see youth that are teens, right? They want to make sure that they have the right shoes, have the right jeans, have the right, they don't want to be inferior to other people. Now the question would be, what is the network that you're creating for that youth, right? And so in the clinic that I'm in, I will ask parents, do you know the numbers of your daughter's friend or your son's friends? And it's very interesting that sometimes seemingly they don't. I couldn't have gone anywhere. My mom didn't know, you know, the other parent. But that seems to be a little bit different now. I'm not saying that that's the case here. But in reference to communicating with your daughter, even with about rejection from others, you should create a space where she or he gets to tell you what they're feeling. You really ask the question, like, how are you feeling? What's going on? And you got to fight the urge to want to respond and fight the urge to want to course correct for them. Because you want them to be able to feel comfortable coming to you and telling you the information. So Roxy's looking at me like, this guy talking so much.
No, it is 9 o'clock and
It is
a
9.
school night, a work night. Oh, but no, Dr. Simon, thank you very much. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge around the medication and some things we can do at home, and some things that can be done in school. So we really appreciate you coming to speak with our families tonight.